41. Frontal Override. The biting January wind howled around the vast, blank stone walls that demarcated the material bounds of the castle Hogwarts, whispering and whistling in odd pitches as it blew past closed windows and stone turrets. The most recent snow had mostly blown away, but occasional patches of melted and refrozen ice still stuck to the stone face and blazed reflected sunlight. From a distance, it must have looked like Hogwarts was blinking hundreds of eyes. A sudden gust made Draco flinch and try, impassibly, to press his body even closer to the stone, which felt like ice and smelled like ice. Some utterly pointless instinct seemed convinced that he was about to be blown off the outer wall of Hogwarts, and that the best way to prevent this was to jerk around in helpless reflex and possibly throw up. Draco was trying very hard not to think about the 6 stories worth of empty air underneath him, and focus, instead, on how he was going to kill Harry Potter. "You know, Mr. Malfoy," said the young girl beside him in a conversational voice, "if a seer had told me that someday I'd be hanging onto the side of a castle by my fingertips, trying not to look down or think about how loud Mum'd scream if she saw me, I wouldn't have had any idea of how it'd happen, except that it'd be Harry Potter's fault." Earlier, the 2 allied generals stepped together over Longbottom's body, their boots hitting the floor in almost perfect synchrony. Only a single soldier now stood between them and Harry, a Slytherin boy named Samuel Clammons, whose hand was clenched white around his wand, held upward to sustain his prismatic wall. The boy's breathing was coming rapidly, but his face showed the same cold determination that lit the eyes of his general, Harry Potter, who was standing behind the prismatic wall at the dead end of the corridor next to an open window, with his hands held mysteriously behind his back. The battle had been ridiculously difficult, for the enemy being outnumbered 2-1. It should have been easy. Dragon Army and the Sunshine Regiment had melded together easily in practice sessions. They'd fought each other long enough to know each other very well indeed. Morale was high, both armies knowing that this time they weren't just fighting to win for themselves, but fighting for a world free of traitors. Despite the surprised protests of both generals, the soldiers of the combined army had insisted on calling themselves Dramioni's Sungarn Argiment, and produced patches for their insignia of a smiling face wreathed in flames. But Harry's soldiers had all blackened their own insignia. It didn't look like paint, more like they'd burned that part of their uniforms, and they'd fought all through the upper levels of Hogwarts with a desperate fury. The cold rage that Draco sometimes saw in Harry had seemed to trickle down into his soldiers, and they'd fought like it hadn't been play. And Harry had emptied out his entire bag of tricks. There had been tiny metal balls. Granger had identified them as ball bearings on floors and staircases, rendering them impassable until cleared. Only Harry's army had already practiced coordinated hover charms, and they could fly their own people right over the obstacles they'd made. You couldn't bring devices into the game from outside, but you could transfigure anything you wanted during the game, so long as it was safe. And that just wasn't fair when you were fighting a boy raised by scientists who knew about things like ball bearings and skateboards and bungee cords. And so it had come to this. The survivors of the Allied forces had cornered the last remnants of Harry Potter's army in a dead-end corridor. Weasley and Vincent had rushed Longbottom at the same time, moving together like they'd practiced for weeks instead of hours, and somehow Longbottom had managed to hex them both before falling himself. And now it was Draco and Granger and Padma and Samuel and Harry, and by the looks of Samuel, his prismatic wall couldn't last much longer. Draco had already leveled his wand at Harry, waiting for the prismatic wall to fall of its own accord. There was no need to waste a breaking drill hex before then. Padma leveled her own wand at Samuel, Granger leveled hers at Harry. Harry was still hiding his hands behind his back instead of aiming his wand, and looking at them with a face that could have been carved out of ice. It might be a bluff. It probably wasn't. There was a brief, tense silence, and then Harry spoke. "I'm the villain now," the young boy said coldly, "and if you think villains are this easy to finish off, you'd better think again. Beat me when I'm fighting seriously, and I'll stay beaten, but lose, and we'll be doing this all over again next time." The boy brought his hands forward, and Draco saw that Harry was wearing strange gloves with a peculiar grayish material on the fingertips, and buckles that stabbed the gloves tightly to his wrists. Beside Draco, the Sunshine General gasped in horror, and Draco, without even asking why, fired a breaking drill. Hex Samuel staggered. He let out a scream as he staggered, but he held the wall. And if Padma or Granger fired now, they would exhaust their own forces so badly that they might just lose. "Harry," shouted Granger. "You can't be serious." Harry was already in motion, and as he swung out the open window, his cold voice said, "Follow if you dare." The icy wind howled around them. Draco's arms were already starting to feel tired. It had developed that, yesterday, Harry had carefully demonstrated to Granger exactly how to transfigure the gloves he was currently wearing, which used something called gecko seti, and how to glue transfigured patches of the same material to the toes of their shoes. And Harry and Granger had, in innocent, childish play, tried climbing around the walls and sealing a little. And that also yesterday, Harry had supplied Granger with a grand total of exactly 2 doses of feather-falling potion to carry around in her pouch, just in case. Not that Padma would have followed them anyway. She wasn't crazy. Draco carefully peeled loose his right hand, stretched it over as far as he could, and slapped it down on the stone again. Beside him, Granger did the same. They'd already swallowed the feather-falling potion. It was skirting the edges of the game rules, but the potion wouldn't be activated unless one of them actually fell, and so long as they didn't fall, they weren't using the item. Professor Quirrell was watching them. The 2 of them were perfectly, completely, utterly safe. Harry Potter, on the other hand, was going to die. "I wonder why Harry is doing this," said General Granger in a reflective tone, as she slowly peeled the fingertips of one hand off the wall with an extended sticky sound, and plopped back down again almost as soon as it was lifted. "I'll have to ask him that after I kill him." It was amazing how much the 2 of them were turning out to have in common. Draco didn't really feel like talking right now, but he managed to say, through gritted teeth, "Could be revenge, for the date." "Really," said Granger, "after all this time." "Stick, plop." "How sweet of him," said Granger. "Stick, plop." "I guess I'll find some truly romantic way to thank him," said Granger. "Stick, plop." "What's he got against you?" said Granger. Stick, plop. The icy wind howled around them. One might have thought it would feel safer to have ground under your feet again, but if that ground was a slanted roof tiled with rough slats which had rather a lot more ice on it than the stone walls, and you were running across it at a high rate of speed, then you would be sadly mistaken. "Luminos!" shouted Draco. "Luminos!" shouted Granger. "Luminos!" shouted Draco. "Luminos!" shouted Granger. The distant figure was dodging and scrambling as it ran, and not a single shot hit, but they were gaining, until Granger slipped. It was inevitable, in retrospect. In real life, you couldn't actually run across icy slanted rooftops at a high rate of speed. And also inevitably, because it happened without the slightest thought, Draco spun and grabbed for Granger's right arm, and he caught her, only she was already too far off balance. She was falling and pulling Draco with her. It all happened so quickly. There was a hard, painful impact, not just Draco's weight hitting the rooftop, but some of Granger's weight too, and if she'd hit just a little bit closer to the edge, they could have made it. But instead her body tipped again and her legs slipped off and her other hand grabbed frantically. And that was how Draco ended up holding onto Granger's arm in a white grip, while her other hand clenched frantically at the edge of the rooftop, and the toes of Draco's shoes dug into the edge of a roof tile. "Hermione!" Harry's voice shrieked distantly. "Draco!" whispered Granger's voice, and Draco looked down. That might have been a mistake. There was a lot of air underneath her, nothing but air. They were on the edge of a rooftop that had jutted out from the main stone wall of Hogwarts. "He's going to come help me," whispered the girl. "But first he's going to Luminos both of us. There's no way he wouldn't. You have to let me go." It should have been the easiest thing in the world. She was just a mudblood, just a mudblood, just a mudblood. She wouldn't even be hurt. Draco's brain wasn't listening to anything Draco was telling it right now. "Do it," Hermione Granger whispered, her eyes blazing without a single trace of fear. "Do it, Draco, do it. You can beat him yourself. We have to win Draco." There was a sound of someone running, and it was coming closer. "Oh, be rational." The voice in Draco's head sounded an awful lot like Harry Potter teaching lessons. "Are you going to let your brain run your life?" Aftermath 1. It was taking a bit of an effort for Daphne Greengrass to keep herself quiet, as Millicent Bulstrode retold the story in the Slytherin Girls' common room, a cozy, cool place in the dungeons running beneath the Hogwarts lake, with fish swimming past every window, and couches you could lie down in if you wanted. Mostly because, in Daphne's opinion, it was a perfectly good story already without all of Millicent's improvements. "And then what?" gasped Flora and Hestia Caro. General Granger looked up at him, Millicent said dramatically, and she said, "Draco, you've got to let go of me. Don't worry about me, Draco. I promise I'll be all right." "And what do you suppose Malfoy did then?" "He said never," shouted Charlotte Willand, and held on even tighter. All the listening girls except Pansy Parkinson nodded. "Nope," said Millicent. "He dropped her, and then he jumped up and shot General Potter. The end." There was a stunned pause. "You can't do that," said Charlotte. "She's a mudblood," said Pansy, sounding confused. "Of course he let go." "Well, Malfoy shouldn't have grabbed her in the first place then," said Charlotte. "But once he grabbed her, he had to hang on, especially in the face of approaching certain doom." Tracy Davis, sitting next to Daphne, was nodding along in firm agreement. "I don't see why," said Pansy. "That's because you don't have the tiniest smidgen of romance in you," said Tracy. "Besides, you can't just go dropping girls." "Boy who'd drop a girl like that. He'd drop anyone. He'd drop you, Pansy." "What do you mean, drop me?" Pansy said. Daphne couldn't resist any more. "You know," Daphne said darkly, "you're eating breakfast one day at our table, and the next thing you know, Malfoy lets go of you and you're falling off the top of Hogwarts. That's what." "Yeah," said Charlotte. "He's a witch dropper." "You know why Atlantis fell?" said Tracy. "'Cause someone like Malfoy dropped it, that's why." Daphne lowered her voice. "In fact, what if Malfoy's the one who made Hermione, I mean General Granger, slip in the first place? What if he's out to make all the Muggleborns trip and fall?" "You mean?" gasped Tracy. "That's right," Daphne said dramatically. "What if Malfoy is the heir of Slytherin?" "The next drop lord," said Tracy, which was far too good a line for anyone to keep to themselves, so by nightfall it was all over Hogwarts, and the next morning it was the Quibblers headline. Aftermath, too. Hermione made sure she got to their usual classroom nice and early that evening, just so that she would be by herself, in a chair, peacefully reading a book when Harry got there. If there was any way for a door to creak open apologetically, that was how the door was creaking open. Said Harry Potter's voice. Hermione kept reading. "I'm, kinda sorry. I didn't mean for you to actually fall off the roof or anything. It had been quite an entertaining experience, in fact. I don't have much experience apologizing. I'll fall to my knees if you want, or buy you something expensive. Hermione, I don't know how to apologize to you for this. What can I do? Just tell me." She kept reading the book in silence. It wasn't as if she had any idea how Harry could apologize, either. Right now, she was just feeling a sort of odd curiosity as to what would happen if she kept reading her book for a while. 42. Courage. "Romantic," Hermione said. "They're both boys." "Wow," Daphne said, sounding a little shocked. "You mean Muggles really do hate that? I thought that was just something the Death Eaters made up." "No," said an older Slytherin girl Hermione didn't recognize. "It's true, they have to get married in secret, and if they're ever discovered, they get burned at the stake together. And if you're a girl who thinks it's romantic, they burn you too." "That can't be right," objected a Gryffindor girl, while Hermione was still trying to sort out what to say to that. There wouldn't be any Muggle girls left. She kept on reading quietly, and Harry Potter had kept on trying to apologize, and it had soon dawned on Hermione that Harry had realized, possibly for the first time in his life, that he'd done something annoying, and that Harry, definitely for the first time in his life, was terrified that he'd lost her as a friend, and she'd started to feel guilty and worried about the direction Harry's increasingly desperate offers were going. But she still had no idea what sort of apology was appropriate, so she'd said that the Ravenclaw girls should vote on it, and this time she wouldn't fix the outcome, though she hadn't mentioned that part, to which Harry had instantly agreed. The next day, practically every Ravenclaw girl over the age of 13 had voted to have Draco drop Harry. Hermione had felt mildly disappointed it was that simple, though it was obviously fair. Right now, however, standing just outside the great doors of the castle, amid half the female population of Hogwarts, Hermione was beginning to suspect that there were things going on here that she did not understand, and that she desperately hoped neither of her fellow generals ever heard about. You couldn't really see the details from up there, just the general fact of a sea of expectant female faces. "You've got no idea what this is about, do you?" said Draco, sounding amused. Harry had read a fair number of books he wasn't supposed to read, not to mention a few quibbler headlines. "Boy who lived gets Draco Malfoy pregnant," said Harry. "Okay, you do know what this is about," said Draco. "I thought muggles hated that." "Only the dumb ones," said Harry. "But aren't we a little young?" "Not too young for them," said Draco. He snorted. "Girls." They silently walked toward the edge of the roof. "I'm doing this for revenge on you," said Draco. "But why are you doing this?" Harry's mind made a lightning calculation, weighing the factors, whether it was too soon. "Honestly," said Harry, "because I meant to have her climb up the icy walls, but I didn't mean to have her fall off the roof. And I kinda did feel really awful about that. I mean, I guess I actually did start seeing her as my friendly rival after a while. So this is a real apology to her, not a plot or anything." There was a pause. Then, "Yeah," said Draco. "I understand." Harry didn't smile. It might have been the most difficult non-smile of his life. Draco looked at the edge of the roof and made a face. "This is going to be a lot harder to do on purpose than by accident, isn't it?" Harry's other hand held the roof in a reflexively terrified grip, his fingers white on the cold, cold stone. You could know with your conscious mind that you'd drunk the feather-falling potion. Knowing it with your unconscious mind was another matter entirely. It was every bit as scary as Harry had thought it might have been for Hermione, which was justice. "Draco," said Harry. Controlling his voice wasn't easy, but the Ravenclaw girls had given them a script. "You've got to let me go." "Okay," said Draco, and let go of Harry's arm. Harry's other hand scrabbled at the edge, and then, without any decision being made, his fingers failed and Harry fell. There was a brief moment when Harry's stomach tried to leap up into his throat, and his body tried desperately to orient itself in the absence of any possible way to do so. There was a brief moment when Harry could feel the feather-falling potion kicking in, starting to slow him, a sort of lurching, cushioning feeling. And then something pulled on Harry, and he accelerated downward again. Faster than gravity, Harry's mouth had already opened and begun screaming, while part of his brain tried to think of something creative he could do. Part of his brain tried to calculate how much time he had left to be creative, and a tiny rump part of his brain noticed that he wasn't even going to finish the remaining time calculation. Before he hit the ground, Harry was desperately trying to control his hyperventilating. And it wasn't helping him to hear the shrieking of all the girls, now lying in heaps on the ground and each other. "Good heavens," said the unfamiliar man, he of the old-looking clothes and faintly scarred face, who was holding Harry in his arms. "Of all the ways I imagined we might meet again someday, I didn't expect it to be you falling out of the sky." Harry remembered the last thing he'd seen, the falling body, and managed to gasp, "Professor Quirrell." "He'll be all right after a few hours," said the unfamiliar man holding Harry. "He's just exhausted. I wouldn't have thought it possible. He must have knocked down 200 students just to make sure he got whoever was jinxing you." Gently, the man set Harry upright on the ground, supporting him the while. Harry carefully balanced himself and nodded to the man. He let go, and Harry promptly fell over. The man helped him rise again, making sure at all times to stand between Harry and the girls, now picking themselves up from the ground, his head constantly glancing in that direction. "Harry," the man said quietly and very seriously, "do you have any idea which of these girls might have wanted to kill you?" "Not murder," said a strained voice. "Just stupidity." This time it was the unfamiliar man who seemed to almost fall over, utter shock on his face. Professor Quirrell was already sitting up from where he'd fallen on the grass. "Good heavens," gasped the man. "You shouldn't be, Mr. Lupin. Your concerns are misplaced. No wizard, no matter how powerful, casts such a charm by strength alone. You must do it by being efficient." Professor Quirrell didn't stand up, though. "Thank you," Harry whispered. And then, "Thank you," to the man standing beside him as well. "What happened?" said the man. "I should have foreseen it myself," Professor Quirrell said, his voice crisp with disapproval. "Some number of girls tried to summon Mr. Potter to their own particular arms. Individually, I suppose, they all thought they were being gentle." "Oh, consider it a lesson in preparedness, Mr. Potter," said Professor Quirrell. "Had I not insisted that there be more than one adult witness to this little event, and that both of us have our wands out, Mr. Lupin would not have been available to slow your fall afterward. and you would have been gravely injured. Sir, said the man, Mr. Lupin, apparently. You should not say such things to the boy. Who is, Harry started to say. The only other person who was available to watch besides myself, said Professor Quirrell. I introduce you to Remus Lupin, who is here temporarily to instruct students in the Patronus charm, though I am told that the two of you have already met. Harry studied the man, puzzled. He should have remembered that faintly scarred face, that strange, gentle smile. Where did we meet? Said Harry. In Godric's Hollow, said the man. I changed a number of your nappies. Mr. Lupin's temporary office was a small stone room with a small wooden desk, and Harry couldn't see anything of what Mr. Lupin was sitting on, suggesting that it was a small stool just like the one in front of his desk. Harry guessed that Mr. Lupin wouldn't be at Hogwarts for long or use this office much, and so he'd told the house elves not to waste the effort. Said something about a person that he tried not to bother house elves. Specifically, it said that he'd been sorted into Hufflepuff, since, to the best of Harry's knowledge, Hermione was the only non-Hufflepuff who worried about bothering house elves. Harry himself thought her qualms rather silly. Whoever had created house elves in the first place had been unspeakably evil, obviously. But that didn't mean Hermione was doing the right thing now by denying sentient beings the drudgery they had been shaped to enjoy. Please sit down, Harry, the man said quietly. His formal robes were of low quality, not quite tattered, but visibly worn by the passage of time in a way that simple repair charms couldn't fix. Shabby was the word that came to mind. And despite that, somehow, there was a dignity about him that couldn't have been obtained by fine and expensive robes, that wouldn't have fit with fine robes. That was the exclusive property of the shabby. Harry had heard of humility, but he'd never seen the real thing before, only the satisfied modesty of people who thought it was part of their style and wanted you to notice. Harry took a seat on the small wooden stool in front of Mr. Lupin's short desk. Thank you for coming, the man said. No, thank you for saving me, said Harry. Let me know if you ever need something impossible done. The man seemed to hesitate. Harry, may I ask a personal question? You can ask, certainly, Harry said. I have a lot of questions for you, too. Mr. Lupin nodded. Harry, are your step-parents treating you well? My parents, Harry said. I have 4, Michael, James, Petunia, and Lily. Ah, said Mr. Lupin, and then again. He seemed to be blinking rather hard. Aye, that is good to hear, Harry. Dumbledore would tell none of us where you were. I was afraid he might think you ought to have wicked step-parents or some such. Harry wasn't sure Mr. Lupin's concern had been misplaced, considering his own first encounter with Dumbledore, but it had all turned out well enough, so he said nothing. What about my? Harry searched for a word that didn't raise them higher or put them lower. Other parents. I want to know, well, everything. A tall order, Mr. Lupin said. He wiped a hand across his forehead. Well, let us begin at the beginning. When you were born, James was so happy that he couldn't touch his wand without it glowing gold for a whole week. And even after that, whenever he held you, or saw Lily holding you, or just thought of you, it would happen again. Every now and then Harry would look at his watch and find that another 30 minutes had passed. He felt slightly bad about making Remus miss dinner, especially since Harry himself would just drop back to 7 p.m. later, but that wasn't enough to stop either of them. Finally, Harry screwed up enough courage to ask the critical question, while Remus was in the middle of an extended discourse on the wonders of James's Quidditch, that Harry couldn't find the heart to squash more directly. And that was when, Remus said, his eyes shining brightly, James pulled off a triple reverse Mulhanny dive with extra backspin. The whole crowd went wild, even some of the Hufflepuffs were cheering. I guess you had to be there, Harry thought, not that being there would have helped in any way, and said, Mr. Lupin. Something about Harry's voice must have reached the man because he stopped in mid-sentence. Was my father a bully? Said Harry. Remus looked at Harry for a long moment. For a little while, Remus said. He grew out of it soon enough. Where did you hear that? Harry didn't answer. He was trying to think of something true to say that would deflect suspicion, but he didn't think fast enough. Never mind, said Remus and sighed. I can guess who. The faintly scarred face was pinched in disapproval. What a thing to tell. Did my father have any extenuating circumstances? Harry said, poor home life or something like that, or was he just being naturally nasty? Cold. Remus's hand swept his hair back, the first nervous gesture Harry had seen from him. Harry, Remus said, you can't judge your father by what he did as a young boy. I'm a young boy, Harry said, and I judge myself. Remus blinked twice at that. I want to know why, Harry said. I want to understand because to me it seems like there isn't any possible excuse for that. Voice shaking a bit. Please tell me anything you know about why he did it, even if it doesn't sound nice. So I don't fall into the same trap myself, whatever it is. It was the thing to do if you were in Gryffindor, Remus said, slowly, reluctantly. And I didn't think so back then. I thought it was the other way around, but it might have been Black who got James into it, really. Black wanted so much to show everyone that he was against Slytherin, you see. We all wanted to believe that blood wasn't destiny. No, Harry, said Remus. I don't know why Black went after Peter instead of running. It was as though Black was making tragedy for the sake of tragedy that day. The man's voice was unsteady. There was no hint, no warning, we all thought, to think that he was to be. Remus's voice cut off. Harry was crying. He couldn't help it. It hurt worse to hear it from Remus than anything he'd ever felt himself. Harry had lost 2 parents he didn't remember, knew only from stories. Remus Lupin had lost all 4 of his best friends in less than 24 hours, and for the loss of his last remaining one, Peter Pettigrew, there'd just been no reason at all. Sometimes it still hurts to think of him in Azkaban, Remus finished, his voice almost a whisper. I am glad, Harry, that Death Eaters are not allowed visitors. It means I do not have to feel ashamed of not going. Harry had to swallow hard several times before he could speak. Can you tell me about Peter Pettigrew? He was my father's friend, and it seems that I should know, that I should remember. Remus nodded, water glittering in his own eyes now. I think, Harry, that if Peter had known it would end that way, the man's voice choked up. Peter was more afraid of the Dark Lord than any of us, and if he'd known it would end that way, I don't think he would have done it. But Peter knew the risk, Harry. He knew the risk was real, that it could happen, and yet he stayed by James and Lily's side. All through Hogwarts I used to wonder why Peter hadn't been sorted into Slytherin, or maybe Ravenclaw, because Peter so adored secrets. He couldn't resist them. He would find out things about people, things they wanted kept hidden. A brief, wry look crossed Remus's face. But he didn't use those secrets, Harry. He just wanted to know. And then the Dark Lord's shadow fell over everything, and Peter stood by James and Lily and put his talents to good use, and I understood why the hat had sent him to Gryffindor. Remus's voice was fierce now, and proud. It's easy to stand by your friends if you're a hero like Godric, bold and strong like people think Gryffindors should be. But if Peter was more afraid than any of us, doesn't that also make him the most brave? It does, Harry said. His own voice was choked to where he almost couldn't talk. If you could, Mr. Lupin, if you have time, there's someone else who I think should hear Peter Pettigrew's story, a student in first-year Hufflepuff named Neville Longbottom. Alice and Frank's boy, said Remus, his voice turning sad. I see. It is not a happy story, Harry, but I can tell it again if you think it will help him. Harry nodded. A brief silence fell. Did Black have any unfinished business with Peter Pettigrew? Harry said. Anything that would make him seek out Mr. Pettigrew, even if it wasn't a killing matter. Like a secret Mr. Pettigrew knew that Black wanted to know himself, or wanted to kill him to hide. Something flickered in Remus's eyes, but the older man shook his head and said, Not really. That means there is something, said Harry. That wry smile appeared again beneath the salt and pepper mustache. You have a bit of Peter in you yourself, I see. But it's not important, Harry. I'm a Ravenclaw. I'm not supposed to resist the temptation of secrets. And, Harry said more seriously, if it was worth Black getting caught, I can't help but think it might matter. Remus looked quite uncomfortable. I suppose I could tell you when you're older, but really, Harry, it's not important. Just something from our school days. Harry couldn't have put his finger on exactly what tipped him off. It might have been something about the exact tone of nervousness in Remus's voice, or the way the man had said, when you're older, that sparked the sudden leap of Harry's intuition. Actually, said Harry, I think I've sort of guessed it already, sorry. Remus raised his eyebrows. Have you? He sounded a bit skeptical. They were lovers, weren't they? There was an awkward pause. Remus gave a slow, grave nod. Once, Remus said. A long time ago. A sad affair, ending in vast tragedy, or so it seemed to us all when we were young. The unhappy puzzlement was plain on his face. But I had thought that long since over and done, and buried beneath adult friendship, until the day that Black killed Peter. 43. Humanism, PT1. The gentle sun of January shone on the cold fields outside Hogwarts. For some of the students, it was a study hour, and others had been let out of class. The first years who'd signed up for it were practicing a certain spell, a spell that was most advantageously learned outdoors, beneath the bright sun and a clear blue sky, rather than within the confines of any classroom. Cookies and lemonade were also considered helpful. The early gestures of the spell were complex and precise. You twitched your wand once, twice, thrice, and 4 times with small tilts at exactly the right relative angles. You shifted your forefinger and thumb exactly the right distances. The ministry thought this meant it was futile to try and teach anyone the spell before their 5th year. There had been a few known cases of younger children learning it, and this had been dismissed as genius. It might not have been a very polite way of putting it, but Harry was beginning to see why Professor Quirrell had claimed that the Ministry Committee of Curriculum would have been of greater benefit to wizardkind if they had been used as landfill. So the gestures were complicated and delicate. That didn't stop you from learning it when you were 11. It meant you had to be extra careful and practice each part for a lot longer than usual. That was all. Most charms that could only be learned by older students were like that because they required more strength of magic than any young student could muster. But the Patronus charm wasn't like that. It wasn't difficult because it needed too much magic. It was difficult because it took more than mere magic. It took the warm, happy feelings that you kept close in your heart, the loving memories, a different kind of strength that you didn't need for ordinary spells. Harry twitched his wand once, twice, thrice, and 4 times, shifted his fingers exactly the right distances. Good luck at school. Harry, do you think I bought you enough books? You can never have enough books. But you certainly tried. It was a really, really, really good try. It had brought tears to his eyes, the first time Harry had remembered and tried to put it into the spell. Harry brought the wand up and around and brandished it, a gesture that didn't have to be precise, only bold and defiant. Expecto Patronum, cried Harry. Nothing happened, not a single flicker of light. When Harry looked up, Remus Lupin was still studying the wand, a rather troubled look on his faintly scarred face. Finally, Remus shook his head. I'm sorry, Harry, the man said quietly. Your wand work was exactly right. And there wasn't a flicker of light anywhere else, either, because all the other first years who were supposed to be practicing their Patronus charms had been glancing out of the corners of their eyes at Harry instead. The tears were threatening to come back into Harry's eyes, and they weren't happy tears. Of all the things, Harry had never expected this. There was something horribly humiliating about being informed that you weren't happy enough. What did Anthony Goldstein have inside him that Harry didn't, that made Anthony's wand shine with that bright light? Did Anthony love his own father more? What thought were you using to cast it? Said Remus. My father, Harry said, his voice trembling. I asked him to buy me some books before I came to Hogwarts, and he did, and they were expensive, and then he asked me if they were enough. Harry didn't try to explain about the Vers family motto. Take a rest before you try a different thought, Harry, said Remus. He gestured toward where some other students were sitting on the ground, looking disappointed or embarrassed or regretful. You won't be able to cast a Patronus charm while you're feeling ashamed of not being grateful enough. There was a gentle compassion in Mr. Lupin's voice, and for a moment, Harry felt like hitting something. Instead, Harry turned around and stalked to where the other failures were sitting. The other students whose wand work had also been proclaimed perfect, and who were now supposed to be searching for happier thoughts. By the looks of them, they weren't making much progress. There were many robes there trimmed in dark blue, and a handful of red, and one lone Hufflepuff girl who was still crying. The Slytherins hadn't even bothered showing up, except for Daphne Greengrass and Tracy Davis, who were still trying to get the gestures. Harry plopped down on the cold, dead grass of winter next to the student whose failure had surprised him the most. So you couldn't do it either, Hermione said. She'd fled the field at first, but she'd come back after that, and you had to look closely at her reddened eyes to see that she'd been crying. Harry said. I'd probably feel a lot worse about that if you hadn't failed. You're the nicest person I know that I've ever met, Hermione, and if you also can't do it, it means I might still be good. I should have gone to Gryffindor, Hermione whispered. She blinked hard a few times, but she didn't wipe her eyes. The boy and the girl walked forward together, definitely not holding hands, but each drawing a kind of strength from the other's presence, something that let them ignore the whispers of their year-mates as they walked through the hallway approaching the great doors of Hogwarts. Harry hadn't been able to cast the Patronus charm, no matter what Happy thought he tried. People hadn't seemed surprised by that, which made it even worse. Hermione hadn't been able to do it either. People had been very surprised by that, and Harry had seen her starting to get the same sidelong looks as him. The other Ravenclaws who'd failed weren't getting those looks. But Hermione was the Sunshine General, and her fans were treating it like she'd failed them, somehow, like she'd betrayed a promise she'd never made. The two of them had gone to the library to research the Patronus charm, which was Hermione's way of dealing with distress, as it was sometimes also Harry's. Study, learn, try to understand why. The books had confirmed what the headmaster had told Harry. Often, wizards who couldn't cast the Patronus charm in practice would be able to do so in the presence of a real Dementor, going from flat failure all the way to a full corporeal Patronus. It defied all logic. The Dementor's aura of fear ought to make it harder to wield a happy thought. But that was the way it was. So the two of them were both going to give it one last try. There was no way either of them wouldn't give it one last try. It was the day the Dementor came to Hogwarts. Earlier, Harry had untransfigured his father's rock from where it usually rested on his pinky ring in the form of a tiny diamond and placed the huge grey stone back into his pouch, just in case Harry's magic failed entirely when he confronted the darkest of all creatures. Harry had already started to feel pessimistic, and he wasn't even in front of a Dementor yet. "I bet you can do it, and I can't," Harry said in a whisper. "I bet that's what happens." "It felt wrong to me," Hermione said, her voice even quieter than his. "I tried it this morning and I realized. When I was doing the brandish at the end, even before I said the words, it felt wrong." Harry didn't say anything. He'd felt the same thing right from the start, though it had taken another 5 attempts using 5 other happy thoughts before he'd been able to acknowledge it to himself. Every time he tried to brandish his wand, it had felt hollow. The spell he was trying to learn didn't fit him. "It doesn't mean we're going to be dark wizards," said Harry. "Lots of people who can't cast the Patronus charm aren't dark wizards. Godric Gryffindor wasn't a dark wizard. Godric had defeated Dark Lords, fought to protect commoners from noble houses and muggles from wizards. He'd had many fine friends and true, and lost no more than half of them in one good cause or another. He'd listened to the screams of the wounded, in the armies he'd raised to defend the innocent. Young wizards of courage had rallied to his calls, and he buried them afterward. Until finally, when his wizardry had only just begun to fail him in his old age, he brought together the 3 other most powerful wizards of his era to raise Hogwarts from the bare ground. The one great accomplishment to Godric's name that wasn't about war, any kind of war, no matter how just. It was Salazar, and not Godric, who taught the first Hogwarts class in battle magic. Godric had taught the first Hogwarts class in herbology, the magics of green growing life. To his last day, he'd never been able to cast the Patronus charm. Godric Gryffindor had been a good man, not a happy one. Harry didn't believe in angst. He couldn't stand reading about whiny heroes. He knew a billion other people in the world would have given anything to trade places with him, and on his deathbed, Godric had told Helga, for Salazar had abandoned him, and Rowena passed before, that he didn't regret any of it, and he was not warning his students not to follow in his footsteps. No one was ever to say he'd told anyone not to follow in his footsteps. If it had been the right thing for him to do, then he wouldn't tell anyone else to choose wrongly, not even the youngest student in Hogwarts. And yet for those who did follow in his footsteps, he hoped they would remember that Gryffindor had told his house that it was all right for them to be happier than him, that red and gold would be bright, warm colors from now on. And Helga had promised him, weeping, that when she was headmistress she would make sure of it. Whereupon Godric had died, and left no ghost behind him, and Harry had shoved the book back to Hermione and walked away a little, so she wouldn't see him crying. You wouldn't think that a book with an innocent title like The Patronus Charm, Wizards Who Could and Couldn't, would be the saddest book Harry had ever read. Harry didn't want that, to be in that book. Harry didn't want that. The rest of the school just seemed to think that no Patronus meant bad person, plain and simple. Somehow the fact that Godric Gryffindor also hadn't been able to cast the Patronus charm seemed not to get repeated. Maybe people didn't talk about it to respect his last wish, Fred and George probably didn't know, and Harry certainly wasn't about to tell them. Or maybe the other failures didn't mention it because it was less shameful, the smaller loss of pride and status, to be thought dark rather than unhappy. Harry saw that Hermione beside him was blinking hard, and he wondered if she was thinking of Rowena Ravenclaw, who'd also loved books. "Okay," Harry whispered. "Happier thoughts. If you do go to a full corporeal patronus, what do you think your animal will be?" "An otter," Hermione said at once. "An otter," Harry whispered incredulously. "Yes, an otter," said Hermione. "What about yours?" "Peregrine falcon," Harry said without hesitation. "It can dive faster than 300 kilometers per hour. It's the fastest living creature there is." The peregrine falcon had been Harry's favorite animal since forever. Harry was determined to become an animagus someday, just to get that as his form and fly by the strength of his own wings and see the land below with sharper eyes. "But why an otter?" Hermione smiled, but didn't say anything, and the vast doors of Hogwarts swung open. They walked for a time, the children, over a pathway that led toward the unforbidden forest and continued through the forest itself. The sun was lowering to near the horizon, the shadows long. The sunlight filtered through the bare branches of the winter trees, for it was January, and the first year's the last to learn that day. Then the path swerved and took a new direction, and they all saw it in the distance, the clearing in the forest, and the sere winter grounds, yellowing dried grass whitened by a few small remnants of snow. The human figures still small at that range. The two spots of dim white light from the Aura's patronesses, and the brighter spot of silver light from the headmaster's, next to something. Harry squinted. Something. It must have been purely Harry's imagination, because there shouldn't have been any way for a Dementor to reach past 3 corporeal patronesses. But he thought he could feel a touch of emptiness brushing at his mind, brushing straight at the soft inner center of himself, without any respect for occlumency barriers. Seamus Finnegan was ashen and trembling as he rejoined the students milling about on the withered and snow-spotted grass. Seamus's patronus charm had been successful, but there was still that interval between when the headmaster dispelled his own patronus and when you were supposed to cast your own, when you faced the Dementor's fear unshielded. Up to 20 seconds of exposure at 5 paces was certainly safe, even for an 11-year-old wizard with weak resistance and a still maturing brain. There was a lot of variance in how hard the Dementor's power hit people, which was another thing not quite understood, but 20 seconds was definitely safe. 40 seconds of Dementor exposure at 5 paces might possibly have been enough to cause permanent damage, though only to the most sensitive subjects. It was harsh training even by the standards of Hogwarts, where the way you learned to fly on a hippogriff was by being tossed on one and told to get going. Harry was no fan of overprotectiveness, and if you looked at the difference in maturity between a 4th year in Hogwarts and a 14-year-old Muggle, it was clear that Muggles were smothering their children. But even Harry had started to wonder if this was pushing it. Not every hurt could be healed afterward. But if you couldn't cast the spell under those conditions, it meant you couldn't rely on using the Patronus charm to defend yourself. Overconfidence was even more dangerous to wizards than to Muggles. Dementors could drain your magic and your physical vitality, not just your happy thoughts, which meant you might not be able to apparate away if you waited too long, or if you didn't recognize the approaching fear until the Dementor was within range for its attack. During his reading, Harry had discovered with considerable horror that some books claimed the Dementor's kiss would eat your soul, and that this was the reason for the permanent, mindless coma into which it put the victims, and that wizards who believed this had deliberately used the Dementor's kiss to execute criminals. It was a certainty that some cold criminals were innocent, and even if they weren't, destroying their souls. If Harry had believed in souls, he would have. Drawn a blank, he just couldn't think of an appropriate response to that. The headmaster was taking security seriously, and so were the 3 auras standing guard. Their leader was an Oceanish-looking man, solemn without being grim, Aura Komodo, whose wand never left his hand. His patroness, an orangutan of solid moonlight, paced back and forth between the Dementor and the first years awaiting their turn. Beside the orangutan moved the bright white panther of Aura Butnaru, a man with a piercing gaze, long black hair in a ponytail, and a long braided goatee. Those 2 auras and their 2 patronesses were all watching the Dementor. On the opposite side of the students was the resting Aura Gorianov, tall and thin and pale and unshaven, sitting back on a chair he'd conjured without word or wand, and maintaining an absent-minded poker face as he scanned the entire scene. Professor Quirrell had shown up not long after the first years began their attempts, and his eyes never strayed far from Harry. The tiny Professor Flitwick, who had been a champion duelist, was fiddling absently with his wand, and his eyes, peering out from within the huge puffy beard that served as his face, stayed focused on Professor Quirrell. And it must have been Harry's imagination, but Professor Quirrell seemed to wince slightly each time the headmaster's patroness winked out to test the next student. Maybe Professor Quirrell was imagining the same placebo effect as Harry, that backwash of emptiness caressing at his mind. Anthony Goldstein, called the voice of the headmaster. Harry quietly walked toward Seamus, even as Anthony began to approach the shining silver phoenix and whatever it was beneath the tattered cloak. "What did you see?" Harry asked Seamus in a low voice. A lot of students hadn't answered Harry when he tried to gather the data, but Seamus was Finnegan of Chaos, one of Harry's lieutenants. Maybe that wasn't fair, but— "Dead," said Seamus in a whisper, greyish and slimy. "Dead and left in water for a while." Harry nodded. "That's what a lot of people see," Harry said. He projected confidence, even though it was fake because Seamus needed it. "Go eat some chocolate, you'll feel better." Seamus nodded and stumbled off toward the table of healing sweets. "Expecto Patronum," cried a young boy's voice. Then there were gasps of shock, even from the auras. Harry spun around to look. There was a brilliant silver bird standing between Anthony Goldstein and the cage. The bird reared its head and let out a cry, and the cry was also silver, as bright and hard and beautiful as metal. And something in the back of Harry's mind said, "If that's a peregrine falcon, I'm going to strangle him in his sleep." "Shut up," Harry said to the thought. "Do you want us to be a dark wizard? What's the point? You're going to end up as one eventually." That wasn't something Harry would usually have thought. "It's a placebo effect," Harry told himself again. "The Dementor can't actually get to me through 3 corporeal patronesses. I'm just imagining what I think it's like. When I actually face the Dementor, it'll feel completely different, and then I'll know I was just being silly before." A slight chill went down Harry's spine then, because he had a feeling that, yes, it would be completely different, and not in a positive direction. The blazing silver phoenix sprang back into existence from the headmaster's wand, the lesser bird vanished, and Anthony Goldstein began to walk back. The headmaster was coming with Anthony instead of calling out the next name, the patroness waiting behind to guard the Dementor. Harry glanced over to where Hermione was standing, just behind the glowing panther. Hermione's turn would have come next, but had apparently just been delayed. She looked stressed. Earlier, she politely asked Harry to please stop trying to distress her. Dumbledore was smiling slightly as he escorted Anthony back toward the others, smiling only slightly because the headmaster looked very, very tired. "Unbelievable," said Dumbledore in a voice that sounded much weaker than his accustomed boom. "A corporeal patroness in his first year, and an astounding number of successes among the other young students. Quirinus, I must acknowledge that you have proved your point." Professor Quirrell inclined his head. "A simple enough guess, I should think. A Dementor attacks through fear, and children are less afraid." "Less afraid," said Aura Gorianov from where he was sitting. "So I said as well," said Dumbledore. And Professor Quirrell pointed out that adults had more courage, not less to fear, which thought, I confess, had never occurred to me before. "That was not my precise phrasing," Professor Quirrell said dryly, "but it will do. And the rest of our agreement, Headmaster." "You say," Dumbledore said reluctantly. "I admit I was not expecting to lose that wager, Quirinus, but you have proven your wisdom." All the students were looking at them, puzzled, except Hermione, who was staring in the direction of the cage and the tall decaying robes, and Harry, who was watching everyone, since he was imagining himself feeling paranoid. Professor Quirrell said, in tones that did not invite further comments, "I am allowed to teach the killing curse to students who wish to learn it, which will render them considerably safer from dark wizards and other pests, and it is foolish to think they will otherwise know no deadly magics." Professor Quirrell paused, his eyes narrowing. "Headmaster, I respectfully observe that you are not looking well. I suggest leaving the remainder of the day's task to Professor Flitwick." Dumbledore shook his head. "We are almost done for the day, Quirinus. I will last. Hermione had approached Anthony. Captain Goldstein, she said, and her voice trembled only a little. Can you give me any advice? Don't be afraid, Anthony said firmly. Don't think about anything it tries to make you think about. You're not just holding up the wand in front of you as a shield against the fear. You're brandishing your wand to drive the fear away. That's how you make a happy thought into something solid. Anthony shrugged helplessly. I mean, I heard all that before, but... Other students were starting to congregate around Anthony with their own questions. Miss Granger, the headmaster said. His voice might have been gentle or just weakened. Hermione straightened her shoulders and followed him. What did you see under the cloak? Harry said to Anthony. Anthony looked at Harry, surprised, and then answered, a very tall man who was dead, I mean, sort of dead-shaped and dead-colored. It hurt to see him, and I knew that was the Dementor trying to get at me. Harry looked back out at where Hermione was confronting the cage and the cloak. Hermione raised her wand into position for the first gestures. The headmaster's phoenix winked out of existence, and Hermione gave a tiny, pathetic shriek, flinched, took a step back. Harry could see her wand moving, and then she brandished it and said, Expecto Patronum. Nothing happened. Hermione turned and ran. Expecto Patronum, said the headmaster's deeper voice, and the silver phoenix blazed back to life. The young girl stumbled and kept running, strange sounds beginning to come from her throat. Hermione, Susan yelled it, and Hannah and Daphne and Ernie, and they all started to run toward her, even as Harry, who was always thinking one step ahead, spun on his own heel and ran for the table with the chocolate. Even after Harry had shoved the chocolate into Hermione's mouth and she chewed and swallowed, she was still breathing in great gasps and crying. Her eyes still seemed unfocused. She can't have been permanently demented. Harry thought desperately at the confusion inside him, the horrible fear and deathly fury beginning to twist around each other. She can't have been. She wasn't exposed for even 10 seconds, let alone 40. But she could be temporarily demented. As Harry realized in that moment, there wasn't any rule that you couldn't be temporarily injured by a Dementor in just 10 seconds if you were sensitive enough. Then Hermione's eyes seemed to focus and dart around and settle on him. Harry, she gasped, and the other students went silent. Harry, don't. Harry was suddenly afraid to ask what he shouldn't do. Was he in her worst memories or some sleep's nightmare that she was now reliving in waking life? Don't go near it, said Hermione. Her hand reached out, grabbed him by the lapel of his robes. You mustn't go near it, Harry. It spoke to me, Harry. It knows you. It knows you're here. What Harry said, and then cursed himself for asking. The Dementor, said Hermione. Her voice rose to a shriek. Professor Quirrell wants it to eat you. In the sudden hush, Professor Quirrell came forward a few steps, but he didn't approach any closer. Harry was there, after all. Miss Granger, he said, and his voice was grave, I think you should have some more chocolate. Professor Flitwick, don't let Harry try, send him back. The headmaster had arrived by then, and he and Professor Flitwick were exchanging worried looks. I did not hear the Dementor speak, the headmaster said. Still, just ask, said Professor Quirrell, sounding a little weary. Did the Dementor say how it would get to Harry? Said the headmaster. All his tastiest parts first, said Hermione. It would eat. Hermione blinked. Some sanity seemed to come back into her eyes. Then she started crying. You were too brave, Hermione Granger, the headmaster said. His voice was gentle and clearly audible. Too much braver than I comprehended. You should have turned and run, not endured and tried to complete your charm. When you are older and stronger, Miss Granger, I know that you will try again, and I know that you will succeed. I'm sorry, Hermione said in gasps. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Harry. I can't tell you what I saw. I didn't look at it. I didn't dare look at it. I knew it was too horrible to ever be seen. It should have been Harry, but he'd hesitated because his hands were all chocolatey. And then Ernie and Susan were there, helping Hermione from where she'd fallen on the grass, leading her toward the snacks table. 5 bars of chocolate later, Hermione seemed to be all right again, and she went over and apologized to Professor Quirrell. But she was always watching Harry every time that he glanced in her direction. He'd stepped toward her only once and stopped when she'd stepped away. Her eyes had silently apologized and silently pleaded for him to leave her be. Neville Longbottom had seen something dead and half-dissolved, oozing and running with a face like a squashed sponge. It was the worst thing anyone had yet described seeing. Neville had been able to produce a small flicker of light from his wand before, but he had, intelligently and with great presence of mind, turned and run away instead of trying to cast his own patronus charm. The headmaster had said nothing to the other students, told no one else to be less brave. But Professor Quirrell had calmly observed that if you made the mistake after being warned, that was when ignorance became stupidity. Professor Quirrell, Harry said in a low voice, having come as close to the defense professor as he dared. What do you see when you don't ask? The voice was very flat. Harry nodded respectfully. What was your original phrasing to the headmaster, if I can ask? Dryly. Our worst memories can only grow worse as we grow older. Ah, Harry said. Logical. Something strange flickered in Professor Quirrell's eyes then as he looked at Harry. Let us hope, Professor Quirrell said, that you succeed upon this try, Mr. Potter. For if you do, the headmaster may teach you his trick of using a patronus to send messages that cannot be forged or intercepted, and the military importance of that is impossible to overstate. It will be a tremendous advantage to the Chaos Legion, and someday, I suspect, this entire country. But if you do not succeed, Mr. Potter, well, I shall understand. Morag McDougal had said, in a wavering voice, ouch, and Dumbledore had recast his patronus right away. Parvati Patil had produced a corporeal patronus in the form of a tiger, larger than Dumbledore's phoenix, though not nearly as bright. There had been a great burst of applause from all the watchers, though not the same shock as when Anthony had done it. And then it was Harry's turn. The headmaster called the name of Harry Potter, and Harry was afraid. Harry knew that he was going to fail, and he knew that it was going to hurt. But he still had to try, because sometimes, in the presence of a Dementor, a wizard went from not a flicker of light to a full corporeal patronus, and no one understood why. And because if Harry couldn't defend himself from Dementors, he had to be able to recognize their approach, recognize the feeling of them in his mind, and run before it was too late. What is my worst memory? Harry had expected the headmaster to give him a worried look, or a hopeful look, or deeply wise advice. But instead Albus Dumbledore only watched him with quiet calm. He thinks I'm going to fail, but he won't sabotage me by telling me so, thought Harry. If he had true words of encouragement to speak, he would speak them. The cage came closer. It was already tarnished, but not rusted away to nothing, not yet. The cloak came closer. It was unraveling and shot through with unpatched holes. It had been new that morning, Aura Gorianoff had said. Headmaster, Harry said, what do you see? The headmaster's voice was also calm. The Dementors are creatures of fear, and as your fear of the Dementor diminishes, so does the fearsomeness of its form. I see a tall, thin, naked man. He is not decaying. He is only slightly painful to look upon. That is all. What do you see, Harry? Harry couldn't see under the cloak. Well, that wasn't right. It was that his mind was refusing to see what was under the cloak. No, his mind was trying to see the wrong thing under the cloak. Harry could feel it, his eyes trying to force a mistake. But Harry had done his best to train himself to notice that tiny feeling of confusion, to automatically flinch away from making stuff up. And every time his mind tried to start inventing a lie about what was under the cloak, that reflex was fast enough to shut it down. Harry looked under the cloak and saw an open question. Harry wouldn't let his mind see something false, and so he didn't see anything, like the part of his visual cortex getting that signal was just ceasing to exist. There was a blind spot under the cloak. Harry couldn't know what was under there, just that it was far worse than any decaying mummy. The unseeable horror beneath the cloak was very close now, but the blazing bird of moonlight, the white phoenix, yet lay between them. Harry wanted to run away like some of the other students had. Half the ones who'd had no luck with their patronus charms just hadn't shown up today in the first place. Of those remaining, half had fled before the headmaster had even dispelled his own patronus, and no one had said a word. There had been a little laughter when Terry had turned and walked back before his own try, and Susan and Hannah, who'd gone before, had yelled at everyone to shut up. But Harry was the boy who lived, and he would lose much respect if he was seen to give up without even trying. Pride and roles seemed to diminish and fall away in the presence of whatever lay beneath the cloak. Why am I still here? It wasn't the shame of others thinking him cowardly that kept Harry's feet in place. It wasn't the hope of repairing his reputation that brought up his wand. It wasn't the desire to master the patronus charm as magic that moved his fingers into the initial position. It was something else, something that had to oppose whatever lay beneath the cloak. This was the true darkness, and Harry had to find out whether it lay within him, the power to drive it back. Harry had planned to try one final time to think of his book-shopping spree with his father. But instead, at the last minute, facing the Dementor, a different memory occurred to him, something he hadn't tried before. A thought that wasn't warm and happy in the ordinary way, but felt righter somehow. And Harry remembered the stars, remembered them burning terribly bright and unwavering in the silent night. He let that image fill him, fill all of him like an occlumency barrier across his entire mind, became once again the bodiless awareness of the void. The bright, silver, shining phoenix vanished, and the Dementor smashed into his mind like the fist of God. Fear/cold/darkness. There was an instant when the two forces clashed head-on, when the peaceful starlit memory held its own against the fear, even as Harry's fingers began the wand motions, practiced until they had become automatic. They weren't warm and happy, those blazing points of light in perfect blackness, but it was an image the Dementor could not easily pierce. For the silent burning stars were vast and unafraid, and to shine in the cold and darkness was their natural state. But there was a flaw, a crack, a fault line in the immovable object trying to resist that irresistible force. Harry felt a twinge of anger at the Dementor for trying to feed on him, and it was like slipping on wet ice. Harry's mind began to slide sideways, into bitterness, black fury, deathly hatred. Harry's wand came up in the final brandish. It felt wrong. Expecto Patronum, his voice spoke, the words hollow and pointless. And Harry fell into his dark side, fell down into his dark side, further and faster and deeper than ever before, down, down, down as the slide accelerated, as the Dementor latched onto the exposed and vulnerable parts and fed on them, eating away the light. A fading reflex scrabbled for warmth, but even as an image of Hermione came to him, or an image of Mum and Dad, the Dementor twisted it, showed him Hermione lying dead on the ground, the corpses of his mother and father, and then even that was sucked away. Into the vacuum rose the memory, the worst memory, something forgotten so long ago that the neural patterns shouldn't have still existed. "Lily, take Harry and go, it's him," shouted a man's voice. "Go, run, I'll hold him off." And Harry couldn't help but think, in the empty depths of his dark side, how ridiculously overconfident James Potter had been. Hold off Lord Voldemort. With what? Then the other voice spoke, high-pitched like the hiss of a tea kettle, and it was like dry ice laid on Harry's every nerve, like a brand of metal cooled to liquid helium temperatures and laid on every part of him. And the voice said, "Avada Kedavra." The wand flew from the boy's nerveless fingers as his body began to convulse and fall, the headmaster's eyes widening in alarm as he began his own patronus charm. "Not Harry, please not Harry," screamed the woman's voice. Whatever was left of Harry listened, with all the light drained out of him, in the dead void of his heart, and wondered if she thought that Lord Voldemort would stop, because she asked politely. "Step aside, woman," said the shrill voice of burning cold. "For you I am not come, only the boy. Not Harry, please. Have mercy, have mercy." Lily Potter, Harry thought, seemed not to understand what type of people became Dark Lords in the first place, and if this was the best strategy she could conceive to save her child's life, that was her final failure as a mother. "I give you this rare chance to flee," said the shrill voice, "but I will not trouble myself to subdue you, and your death here will not save your child. Step aside, foolish woman, if you have any sense in you at all. Not Harry, please no, take me, kill me instead." The empty thing that was Harry wondered if Lily Potter seriously imagined that Lord Voldemort would say yes, kill her, and then depart leaving her son unharmed. "Very well," said the voice of death, now sounding coldly amused. "I accept the bargain, yourself to die and the child to live. Now drop your wand so that I can murder you." There was a hideous silence. Lord Voldemort began to laugh, horrible, contemptuous laughter. And then, at last, Lily Potter's voice shrieked in desperate hate. "Avada Key," the lethal voice finished first, the curse rapid and precise. "Avada Kedavra." A blinding flare of green marked the end of Lily Potter. And the boy in the crib saw it, the eyes, those two crimson eyes, seeming to glow bright red, to blaze like miniature suns, filling Harry's whole vision as they locked to his own. The other children saw Harry Potter fall. They heard Harry Potter scream, a thin, high-pitched scream that seemed to pierce their ears like knives. There was a brilliant silver flash, as the headmaster bellowed expecto patronum, and the blazing phoenix returned to being. But Harry Potter's horrible scream went on and on and on, even as the headmaster scooped up the boy in his arms and bore him away from the Dementor, even as Neville Longbottom and Professor Flitwick both went for the chocolate at the same time, and Hermione knew it. She knew it as she saw it. She knew that her nightmare had been real. It was coming true. Somehow it was coming true. "Get him chocolate," demanded the voice of Professor Quirrell, pointlessly, because Professor Flitwick's tiny form was already cannonballing toward where the headmaster was racing toward the students. Hermione was moving forward herself, though she didn't know what else she meant to do, cast patronuses. Shouted the headmaster as he brought Harry behind the auras. "Everyone who can, get them between Harry and the Dementor. It's still feeding on him." There was a moment of frozen horror. "Expecto patronum," shouted Professor Flitwick and Aura Gorianoff, and then Anthony Goldstein, but he failed the first time, and then Parvati Patil, who succeeded, and then Anthony tried again, and his silver bird spread its wings and screamed at the Dementor, and Dean Thomas roared the words like they had been written in letters of fire, and his wand gave birth to a towering white bear. There were 8 blazing patronuses all in a line between Harry and the Dementor, and Harry went on screaming and screaming as the headmaster laid him on the dried grass. Hermione couldn't cast a patronus charm, so she ran toward where Harry lay. In her mind, something tried to guess how long it had been already. Was it 20 seconds? More? There was a dreadful agony and bewilderment on the face of Albus Dumbledore. His long black wand was in his hand, but he spoke no spells, only looked down at Harry's convulsing body in horror. Hermione didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to do. She didn't understand what was happening, and the most powerful wizard in the world seemed equally at a loss. "Use your phoenix," bellowed Professor Quirrell. "Take him far away from that Dementor." Without a single word, the headmaster scooped up Harry in his arms and vanished in a crack of fire along with the suddenly appearing fox, and the headmaster's patronus winked out where it had guarded the Dementor. Horror and confusion and sudden babble. "Mr. Potter should recover," Professor Quirrell said, raising his voice, but his tone now calm once again. "I think it was just over 20 seconds. Then the blazing white phoenix appeared again, like it was flying before them from elsewhere. To Hermione Granger came the creature of moonlight, and it cried to her in Albus Dumbledore's voice. "It still feeds on him, even here." "How? If you know Hermione Granger, you must tell me. Tell me." The senior aura turned to stare at her, and so did many students. Professor Flitwick didn't turn. He was now leveling his wand on Professor Quirrell, who was holding out clearly empty hands. Seconds ticked past, uncounted. She couldn't remember it. She couldn't remember the nightmare clearly. She couldn't remember why she had thought it was possible, why she had been afraid. Hermione realized then what she ought to do, and it was the hardest decision of her life. What if whatever had happened to Harry happened to her too? All her limbs cold as death, her vision gone dark, fear overwhelming everything. She'd seen Harry dying, Mum and Dad dying, all her friends dying, everyone dying, so that in the end, when she died, she would be alone. That was her secret nightmare she'd never talked about with anyone, that had given the Dementor its power over her. The loneliest thing was to die alone. She didn't want to go to that place again. She didn't. She didn't want to stay there forever. "You have courage enough for Gryffindor," said the calm voice of the Sorting Hat in her memory. "But you will do what is right in any house I give you. You will learn, you will stand by your friends, in any house you choose. So don't be afraid, Hermione Granger, just decide where you belong." There was no time for deciding. Harry was dying. "I can't remember now," said Hermione, her voice cracking. "But just hold on, I'll go in front of the Dementor again." She started to run toward the Dementor. "Miss Granger," squeaked Professor Flitwick, but he made no move to stop her, only kept holding his wand on Professor Quirrell. "Everyone," shouted Aura Komodo in a voice of military command. "Get your patronuses out of her way." "Flitwick," roared Professor Quirrell. "Summon Potter's wand." Even as Hermione understood, Professor Flitwick was already crying Accio, and she saw the stick of wood zooming up from where it had lain, almost touching the Dementor's cage. The eyes opened, dead and vacant. "Harry," gasped a voice in the colorless world. "Harry, speak to me." The face of Albus Dumbledore leaned over into the field of vision, which had been occupied by a distant marble ceiling. "You're annoying," said the empty voice. You should die. 44. Humanism, PT2. Fox, said Albus Dumbledore, his voice cracking. Help him, please. A brilliant creature of red gold shuffled into the field of vision, looking down quizzically, and it began to croon. The meaningless chirps slid off the emptiness. There was nothing onto which they could hold. You're noisy, said the voice. You should die. Chocolate, Albus Dumbledore said. You need chocolate and your friends, but I dare not take you back. Then a shining raven came and spoke in Professor Flitwick's voice, whereupon Albus Dumbledore gasped in sudden comprehension and cursed aloud at his own stupidity. The empty thing laughed at that, for it had retained the capacity to be amused, and a moment later they had all vanished in another flash of fire. It was only a moment, it seemed, between when Flitwick's raven had flown to elsewhere, and when Albus Dumbledore reappeared in another crack of red and golden fire with Harry in his arms. But somehow in that time, Hermione had already managed to fill her hands with chocolate. Before Hermione even got there, chocolate had zoomed off the table and straight into Harry's mouth, which a tiny part of her mind said was unfair. He got a chance to do it, for Harry spat the chocolate back out again. Go away, said a voice so empty it wasn't even cold. Everything seemed to freeze. Everyone who had been moving toward Harry halted, all movements broken by the shock of those two dead words. Then, no, said Albus Dumbledore, I will not. And time resumed again, even as another piece of chocolate zoomed off the table and into Harry's mouth. Hermione was close enough now that she could see Harry's expression become more hateful as his mouth chewed with a mechanical, unnatural rhythm. Headmaster's voice was grim as iron. Phileas, call Minerva, tell her she must come at speed. Professor Flitwick whispered to his silver raven, and it flew into the air and vanished. Another piece of chocolate floated into Harry's mouth, and the mechanical chewing continued. There were more students gathering around where the headmaster watched over Harry with grim eyes. Neville, Seamus, Dean, Lavender, Ernie, Terry, Anthony, none of them daring to approach any closer than Hermione had. What can we do? Said Dean in a trembling voice. Back off and give him more space, said the dry voice of Professor Quirrell. No, interrupted the headmaster. Let him be surrounded by his friends. Harry swallowed his chocolate and said in that empty voice, They're stupid. They should die MMMPPPHHH, as another piece of chocolate entered his mouth. Hermione saw the looks of shock that crossed their faces. He doesn't mean it, does he? Seamus said it like he was begging. You don't understand, Hermione said, her voice breaking. That's not Harry, and she shut up before she said anything more, but she had to say that much. She saw from the look on his face that Neville understood, and she also saw that the others didn't. If Harry had really never thought anything like that, then being exposed to a Dementor for less than a minute wouldn't have made him say it. That's what they were probably thinking. Less than a minute of Dementor exposure couldn't create a whole new evil person inside you out of nothing. But if that person was already there, does the headmaster know? Hermione looked up at the headmaster and found that Albus Dumbledore was gazing at her, and that his blue eyes had grown suddenly piercing. Words came into her mind. Do not speak of it, said the will of Dumbledore to her. You know, thought Hermione, about his dark side. I know, but this is beyond even that. Fox's song cannot reach him where he is lost. What can we? I have a plan, sent the headmaster. Patience. Something about the tenor of that thought made Hermione nervous. What sort of plan? It is better that you not know, sent the headmaster. Now Hermione was getting really nervous. She didn't know how much the headmaster knew about Harry's dark side. A fair point, sent the headmaster. I am about to tell you. Steel yourself so as not to react. Are you ready? Good. I am going to pretend to cast the killing curse on Professor McGonagall. Do not react, Hermione. That took work. The headmaster really was crazy. That wouldn't bring Harry out of his dark side. Harry would go completely berserk. He'd kill the headmaster. But that is not true darkness, sent Albus Dumbledore. That is protectiveness. That is love. Fox will be able to reach him then. And when Harry sees that Minerva is alive after all, it will return him fully. The thought came to Hermione, I doubt that will work, sent the headmaster, and you may not like the way he reacts if you try. But you may try if you wish. She hadn't really meant that seriously. It was two. Then her eyes moved, breaking gaze with the headmaster, going to the boy looking around with empty, despising eyes as his mouth kept chewing and swallowing bar after bar of chocolate without effect. Her heart wrenched, and suddenly a lot of things didn't seem to matter, only that there was a chance. There was a compulsion to chew and swallow chocolate. The response to compulsion was killing. People had gathered around and stared. That was annoying. The response to annoyance was killing. Other people were chattering in the background. That was insolent. The response to insolence was to inflict pain, but since none of them were useful, killing them would be simpler. Killing all those people would be difficult. But many of them didn't trust Quirrell, who was strong. Finding exactly the right trigger could cause them all to kill each other. Then a person leaned over into the field of vision and did something completely strange, something that belonged to a foreign mode of thought, for which there was only a single response stored anywhere. She heard the gasps around her, and they didn't matter. She maintained the kiss on those chocolate-smeared lips as the tears welled in her eyes. And Harry's arms came up and pushed her away, and his lips yelled, "I told you, no kissing." "I think he'll be all right now," the headmaster said, looking at where Harry was crying in great wretched sobs as Fawkes crooned over him. "Excellently done, Miss Granger. Do you know, not even I would have expected that to actually work." The Phoenix's song wasn't meant for her, Hermione knew, but she could still be soothed by it, which she needed, because her life was officially over. 45. Humanism, PT3. Fox's song gently trailed off into nothing. Harry sat up from where he had lain on the winter-blasted grass, Fox still perched on his shoulder. There were intakes of breath from all around him. "Harry," said Seamus in a wavering voice, "are you all right?" The peace of the Phoenix was still in him, and warmth from where Fox perched. Warmth spreading out through him, and the memory of the song still alive in the Phoenix's presence. There were terrible things that had happened to him, terrible thoughts that had passed through him. He had regained an impossible memory, for all that the Dementor had made him desecrated. A strange word kept echoing in his mind, and all of that could be put on hold for later, while the Phoenix still shone red and gold beneath the setting sun. Fox cawed at him. "Something I have to do," Harry said to Fox. "What?" Fox bobbed its head in the direction of the Dementor. Harry looked at the unseeable horror still in its cage, then back at the Phoenix, puzzled. "Mr. Potter," said Minerva McGonagall's voice from behind him. "Are you all right?" Harry climbed to his feet and turned. Minerva McGonagall was looking at him, looking very worried. Albus Dumbledore beside her was studying him carefully. Phileas Flitwick appeared tremendously relieved, and all the students were just plain staring. "I think so, Professor McGonagall," Harry said calmly. He'd almost said Minerva before managing to stop himself. While Fawkes was on his shoulder at least, Harry was fine. It might be that he would collapse a moment after Fawkes left, but somehow thoughts like that didn't seem important. "I think I'm okay." There ought to have been cheering or sighs of relief or something, but no one seemed to know what to say, no one at all. The peace of the Phoenix lingered. Harry turned back. "Hermione," he said. Everyone with the tiniest smidgen of romance in their hearts held their breath. "I don't really know how to say thank you graciously," Harry said quietly, "any more than I know how to apologize. All I can say that if you're wondering whether it was the right thing to do, it was." The boy and the girl gazed into each other's eyes. "Sorry," Harry said. "About what happens next. If there's anything I can do—" "No," Hermione said back. "There isn't. It's all right, though." Then she turned from Harry and walked away, toward the path that led back to the gates of Hogwarts. A number of girls gave Harry puzzled looks and then followed her. As they went, you could hear the excited questions starting. Harry looked at them as they left, turned back to look at the other students. They'd seen him on the ground, screaming, and Fox nuzzled his cheek briefly. And that would help them, someday, understanding that the boy who lived could also be hurt, could be wretched. So that when they were hurt and wretched themselves, they would remember seeing Harry writhing on the ground and know that their own pain and troubles didn't mean they'd never amount to anything. Had the headmaster calculated that when he had let the other students stay and watch? Harry's eyes went back to the tall, tattered cloak, almost absent-mindedly, and without really being aware of what he was speaking, Harry said, "It shouldn't ought to exist." "Ah," said a dry, precise voice. "I thought you might say that." "I'm very sorry to tell you, Mr. Potter, that Dementors cannot be killed. Many have tried." "Really?" Harry said, still absent-mindedly. "What did they try?" "There is a certain extremely dangerous and destructive spell," Professor Quirrell said, "which I will not name here, a spell of cursed fire. It is what you would use to destroy an ancient device such as the Sorting Hat. It has no effect on Dementors. They are undying." "They are not undying," said the headmaster. The words mild, the gaze sharp. "They do not possess eternal life. They are wounds in the world, and attacking a wound only makes it larger." "Ahem," Harry said. "Suppose you threw it into the sun. Would it be destroyed?" "Throw it into the sun," squeaked Professor Flitwick, looking like he wanted to faint. "It seems unlikely, Mr. Potter," Professor Quirrell said dryly. "The sun is very large, after all. I doubt the Dementor would have much effect on it. But it is not a test I would like to try, Mr. Potter, just in case." "I see," Harry said. Fox cawed a final time, mantled his wings around Harry's head, and then launched himself from Harry. Launched himself straight toward the Dementor, screaming a great piercing cry of defiance that echoed around the field. And before anyone could react to that, there was a flash of fire and Fox was gone. The peace faded a little. The warmth faded a little. Harry took in a deep breath, let it out again. "Yep," Harry said. "Still alive." Again that silence. Again the absence of cheering. No one seemed to know how to respond. "It is good to know you are fully recovered, Mr. Potter," Professor Quirrell said firmly, as though to deny any other possibility. "Now, I believe Miss Ransom was up next." That started a bit of an argument in which Professor Quirrell was right and everyone else was wrong. The defense professor pointed out that, despite the understandable emotions of all concerned, the chance of a similar mishap occurring to any other student verged on the infinitesimal, the more so as they now knew to avoid mischances with wands. And meanwhile, there were other students who needed to take their own best chance at casting a corporeal patronus charm, or else learn the feeling of a Dementor so they could flee and discover their own degree of vulnerability. In the end, it turned out that Dean Thomas and Ron Weasley of Gryffindor were the only ones left who were still willing to go anywhere near the Dementor, which simplified the argument. Harry glanced in the Dementor's direction. The word echoed in his mind again. All right, Harry thought to himself, if the Dementor is a riddle, what is the answer? And just like that, it was obvious. Harry looked at the tarnished, slightly corroded cage. He saw what lay beneath the tall, tattered cloak. That was it then. Professor McGonagall came and spoke to Harry. She hadn't seen the worst of it, so there was only a slight glitter of water in her eyes. Harry told her that he needed to talk to her afterward and ask a question he'd put off for a while. But that didn't need to happen right now, if she was busy. There was a certain look about her which suggested that she had been pulled away from something important, and Harry observed this to her and said that she honestly didn't need to feel guilty about leaving. This earned him something of a sharp look, but then leave she did, hurriedly, with a promise that they would talk later. Dean Thomas cast his white bear again, even in the Dementor's presence, and Ron Weasley put up an adequate shield of sparkling mist, which concluded the day so far as everyone else was concerned, and Professor Flitwick began to herd the students back to Hogwarts. When it was clear that Harry meant to stay behind, Professor Flitwick looked at him quizzically, and Harry, for his part, glanced significantly at Dumbledore. Harry didn't know what Professor Flitwick made of that, but after a sharp gaze of warning, his head of house departed. And so remained only Harry, Professor Quirrell, Headmaster Dumbledore, and an Auror trio. It would have been better to get rid of the trio first, but Harry couldn't think of a good way to do that. "All right," said Auror Komodo, "let's take it back." "Excuse me," Harry said. "I'd like to have another go at the Dementor." Harry's request met with a certain amount of opposition of the "you're completely insane" variety, though it was only Auror Butnaru who actually said that out loud. "Fox told me to," Harry said. This did not overcome all the opposition, despite the look of shock it produced on Dumbledore's face. The argument went on, and it was starting to wear the edges off the Phoenix's remaining piece, which annoyed Harry, though only a little. "Look," Harry said, "I'm pretty sure I know what I was doing wrong before. There's a kind of person who has to use a different sort of warm and happy thought. Just let me try it, okay?" This did not prove persuasive either. "I think," Professor Quirrell said finally, staring at Harry with narrowed eyes, "that if we do not allow him to do this under supervision, he may, at some point or another, sneak off and look for a Dementor on his own. Do I accuse you falsely, Mr. Potter?" There was an appalled pause at this. It seemed like a good time to play his trump card. "I don't mind if the headmaster keeps his own patronus up," Harry said, "for I will be in the presence of a Dementor just the same, patronus or no." There was confusion at this. Even Professor Quirrell looked puzzled. But the headmaster finally acceded, since it didn't seem likely that Harry could be hurt through 4 patronesses. If the Dementor could not reach through your patroness on some level, Albus Dumbledore, you would not see a naked man painful to look upon. Harry didn't say it out loud, for obvious reasons, and they began to walk toward the Dementor. Headmaster, Harry said, suppose the Ravenclaw door asked you this riddle. What lies at the center of a Dementor? What would you say? Fear, said the headmaster. It was a simple enough mistake. The Dementor approached, and the fear came over you. The fear hurt. You felt the fear weakening you. You wanted the fear to go away. It was natural to think the fear was the problem. So they'd concluded that the Dementor was a creature of pure fear, that there was nothing there to fear but fear itself, that the Dementor couldn't hurt you if you weren't afraid. But what lies at the center of a Dementor? Fear. What is so horrible that the mind refuses to see it? Fear. What is impossible to kill? Fear. It didn't quite fit once you thought about it, though it was clear enough why people would be reluctant to look beyond the first answer. People understood fear. People knew what they were supposed to do about fear. So, faced with a Dementor, it wouldn't exactly be comforting to ask, what if the fear is just a side effect rather than the main problem? They had come very close to the Dementor's cage, guarded by 4 patronesses, when there came sharp intakes of breath from the 3 Auras and Professor Quirrell. Everyone's faces turned to look at the Dementor, seeming to listen. There was horror on Aura Gorianov's face. Then Professor Quirrell raised his head, his face hard, and spat toward the Dementor. It did not like having its prey taken from it, I suppose, Dumbledore said quietly. Well, if it becomes necessary, Quirinus, there will always be a refuge for you at Hogwarts. What did it say? Said Harry. Every head swung to stare at him. You didn't hear it, Dumbledore said. Harry shook his head. It said to me, said Professor Quirrell, that it knew me, and that it would hunt me down someday, wherever I tried to hide. His face was rigid, showing no fright. Ah, Harry said. I wouldn't worry about that, Professor Quirrell. It's not like Dementors can actually talk or think. The structure they have is borrowed from your own mind and expectations. Now everyone was giving him very strange looks. The Auras were glancing nervously at each other, at the Dementor, at Harry. They stood directly before the Dementor's cage. They are wounds in the world, Harry said. It's just a wild guess, but I'm guessing the one who said that was Godric Gryffindor. Yes, said Dumbledore. How did you know? It is a common misconception, thought Harry, that all the best rationalists are sorted into Ravenclaw, leaving none for other houses. This is not so. Being sorted into Ravenclaw indicates that your strongest virtue is curiosity, wondering and desiring to know the true answer. And this is not the only virtue a rationalist needs. Sometimes you have to work hard on a problem and stick to it for a while. Sometimes you need a clever plan for finding out. And sometimes what you need more than anything else to see an answer is the courage to face it. Harry's gaze went to what lay beneath the cloak, the horror far worse than any decaying mummy. Rowena Ravenclaw might also have known, for it was an obvious enough riddle once you saw it as a riddle. And it was also obvious why the patronesses were animals. The animals didn't know, and so were sheltered from the fear. But Harry knew, and would always know, and would never be able to forget. He tried to teach himself to face reality without flinching, and though Harry had not yet mastered that art, still those grooves had been worn into his mind, the learned reflex to look toward the painful thought instead of away. Harry would never be able to forget by thinking warm, happy thoughts about something else, and that was why the spell hadn't worked for him. So Harry would think a warm, happy thought that wasn't about something else. Harry drew forth his wand that Professor Flitwick had returned to him, put his feet into the beginning stance for the Patronus charm. Within his mind, Harry discarded the last remnants of the Peace of the Phoenix, put aside the calm, the dreamlike state, remembered instead Fawkes's piercing cry, and roused himself for battle, called upon all the pieces and elements of himself to awaken, raised up within himself all the strength that the Patronus charm could ever draw upon, to put himself into the right frame of mind for the final warm and happy thought, remembered all bright things, the books his father had bought him. Mum's smile when Harry had handmade her a Mother's Day card, an elaborate thing that had used half a pound of spare electronics parts from the garage to flash lights and beep a little tune, and had taken him 3 days to make. Professor McGonagall telling him that his parents had died well, protecting him. as they had, realizing that Hermione was keeping up with him and even running faster, that they could be true rivals and friends. Coaxing Draco out of the darkness, watching him slowly move toward the light. Neville and Seamus and Lavender and Dean and everyone else who looked up to him, everyone that he would have fought to protect if anything threatened Hogwarts, everything that made life worth living. His wand rose into the starting position for the Patronus charm. Harry thought of the stars, the image that had almost held off the Dementor even without a Patronus. Only this time, Harry added the missing ingredient. He'd never truly seen it, but he'd seen the pictures and the video. The Earth, blazing blue and white with reflected sunlight as it hung in space, amid the black void and the brilliant points of light. It belonged there, within that image, because it was what gave everything else its meaning. The Earth was what made the stars significant, made them more than uncontrolled fusion reactions, because it was Earth that would someday colonize the galaxy and fulfill the promise of the night sky. Would they still be plagued by Dementors, the children's children's children, the distant descendants of humankind as they strode from star to star? No, of course not. The Dementors were only little nuisances, paling into nothingness in the light of that promise. Not unkillable, not invincible, not even close. You had to put up with little nuisances if you were one of the lucky and unlucky few to be born on Earth, on ancient Earth, as it would be remembered someday. That too was part of what it meant to be alive, if you were one of the tiny handful of sentient beings born into the beginning of all things, before intelligent life had come fully into its power. That the much vaster future depended on what you did here now in the earliest days of dawn, when there was still so much darkness to be fought, and temporary nuisances like Dementors. Mum and Dad, Hermione's friendship and Draco's journey, Neville and Seamus and Lavender and Dean, the blue sky and brilliant sun and all bright things, the earth, the stars, the promise, everything humanity was and everything it would become. On the wand, Harry's fingers moved into their starting positions. He was ready, now, to think the right sort of warm and happy thought. And Harry's eyes stared directly at that which lay beneath the tattered cloak, looked straight at that which had been named Dementor. The void, the emptiness, the hole in the universe, the absence of color and space, the open drain through which warmth poured out of the world. Fear it exuded stole away all happy thoughts. Its closeness drained your power and strength. Its kiss would destroy everything that you were. I know you now, Harry thought as his wand twitched once, twice, thrice, and 4 times, as his fingers slid exactly the right distances. I comprehend your nature. You symbolize death. Through some law of magic, you are a shadow that death casts into the world. And death is not something I will ever embrace. It is only a childish thing that the human species has not yet outgrown. And someday, we'll get over it, and people won't have to say goodbye anymore. The wand rose up and leveled straight at the Dementor. Expecto Patronum. The thought exploded from him like a breaking dam, surged down his arm into his wand, burst from it as blazing white light. Light that became corporeal, took on shape and substance. A figure with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, standing upright. The animal Homo sapiens, the shape of a human being. Glowing brighter and brighter as Harry poured all his strength into his spell. Blazing with incandescent light, brighter than the fading sunset. The auras and Professor Quirrell shielding their eyes in shock. And someday, when the descendants of humanity have spread from star to star, they won't tell the children about the history of ancient Earth until they're old enough to bear it. And when they learn, they'll weep to hear that such a thing as death had ever once existed. The figure of a human shone, more brilliant now than the noonday sun, so radiant that Harry could feel the warmth of it on his skin, and Harry sent out all his defiance at the shadow of death, opening all the floodgates inside him to make that bright shape blaze even brighter and yet brighter. You are not invincible, and someday the human species will end you. I will end you if I can, by the power of mind and magic and science. I won't cower in fear of death, not while I have a chance of winning. I won't let death touch me. I won't let death touch the ones I love. And even if you do end me before I end you, another will take my place, and another, until the wound in the world is healed at last. Harry lowered his wand, and the bright figure of a human faded away. Slowly he exhaled. Like waking up from a dream, like opening his eyes after sleep, Harry's gaze moved away from the cage, He looked around and saw that everyone was staring at him. Albus Dumbledore was staring at him. Professor Quirrell was staring at him. The Auror trio was staring at him. They were all looking at him like they'd just seen him destroy a Dementor. The tattered cloak lay empty within the cage.